Hello and welcome to Spotlight on Africa, a podcast by RFI English. I'm Melissa Shimam, and twice a month we'll look at the major issues that affect the continent, one ID or one country at a time. This week we're going to Sudan as the conflict is entering its fourth year this April. Drone strikes are increasing both by Sudan's army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, which have been at war since April 2023. In recent months, daily drone strikes of that kind have disrupted life across Sudan, particularly in the southern Kordofan region, which has become one of the main battlegrounds of the war, and in RSF-controlled areas of the west, including Darfur. The United Nations said the attacks killed more than 500 civilians between January and March, warning of the devastating impact of high-tech and relatively cheap weapons in populated areas. And according to the World Health Organization, more than 2,000 people have been killed and 720 injured in over 200 attacks on health facilities across Sudan since the war began. This conflict has thus killed tens of thousands in 3 years altogether and displaced more than 11 million people. It also created what the UN describes as the world's largest displacement and hunger crisis. The war has effectively divided Sudan, with the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, controlling the north, east and center, and the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, a Sudanese paramilitary force dominating Darfur and part of the country's south, with the help of allied forces. In 3 years, the war has also seen more and more foreign powers being accused of meddling in the conflict, supporting a party or another, including Russia, Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, and most recently, Ethiopia. And we'll hear about it more in this episode. First, my colleague Anne-Marie Besada spoke to the newly appointed advisor to the Transitional Sovereignty Council, TSC, chairman in Sudan, Amgad Fared El-Tayeb, on the line from Khartoum. She asked him what has changed, according to him, in Sudan this past year.
What have changed since last year? The Sudanese armed forces, the governmental forces, have restored its control over the majority of the Sudanese land, except for Darfur and a few pockets in Blue Nile and West Kordofan. I think the Sudanese government have established control over most of the country, and people have begun returning to their normal livelihood areas, whether in the capital Khartoum or in other areas. But politically, we are not really near any real end, because the RSF, as I said, remains entrenched in Darfur and part of West Kordofan. And recently they opened this new front from Ethiopia against areas in Blue Nile state.
Anne-Marie also joined Omar Dinia in Cairo, Egypt. He's a Sudanese author and analyst who left for Egypt 4 months after the RSF took over Khartoum. He says more and more people seem to now support strongly the SAF in government-controlled areas. She asked him why, and here is what he had to say.
The confrontation is between SAF and the RSF, right? And we know before the war started, almost all Sudanese were against SAF. We had a lot of concern about their attitude and everything they did. After the war started, we'd be more concerned about preserving our country. You know, before that, it was a political issue. You know, it was like who to rule Sudan? Do we get elections or not? The government, how do we shape our government? Those are political questions, see? Yeah. But after the war started, it was not political anymore. It was about, are we going to survive? Are we going to exist anymore?
It's about survival.
Exactly.
So just going back to you're saying the Sudanese are basically right now, before it was just against SAF because it was a political move and you had maybe a bit more time or more opportunity to act like that. But now it's more out of necessity. You want SAF to put an end to this. And they're the only ones who can do it.
Exactly. You know, yes, before we were talking politics. Now, since the war started, we're talking survival. That's a completely different topic. And the problem is, I know that SAF, among millions of other Sudanese, we know that SAF could have prevented this war And the RSF exploited the sloppiness of the SAF.
Okay.
The sloppiness that was intentional. It's not like they messed up in good faith. No, they did not.
Melissa Shaman. Spotlight on Africa.
Now, according to Human Rights Watch, as the conflict in Sudan drags on, civilians continue to bear the brunt of the atrocities. Fighting have been marked by war crimes and other violation of international humanitarian law committed by all warring parties. The NGO's latest report now finds that forces affiliated with the SAF have arbitrarily detained, tortured and ill-treated civilians in area under their control, denying them due process rights. Meanwhile, what has changed too is that the RSF have been accused since March by the Sudanese military of launching drone attacks from inside Ethiopian territory. This constitutes the first public allegation of Ethiopian involvement in the conflict. Ethiopia has denied the claim and has also rejected allegation that it is hosting RSF camps. But the Yale School of Public Health Humanitarian Research Lab shows analysis of satellite imagery and open source data that shows activity consistent with military assistance to the RSF at an Ethiopian base. It's in Asosa inside Ethiopia between late December 2025 at least and late March this year. On top of that, the US-Israeli war against Iran and Tehran's retaliation in the Persian Gulf are also exacerbating tension over the humanitarian supply of medicine in Africa altogether, a sector already severely affected by funding cuts. And Sudan is directly affected. To discuss the recent involvement of Ethiopia on the side of the RSF and the recent changes in the conflict, we have now on the line Christy Cooney, is the chief of the Sudan team for the NGO Avaz and is constantly in contact with staff inside Sudan.
My name's Christy Cooney. I'm a reporter in the Sudan team at the Avaz NGO, and I cover Sudan.
Welcome. Thank you for being with us. The latest is that the war has now lasted for 3 years and it's entering its fourth year. What your organization has been able to document now is how the situation has evolved on the front of the border with Ethiopia. First, can you tell us the latest?
The state that immediately borders Ethiopia is down in the southeastern corner of Sudan. Blue Nile had been relatively untouched by much of the conflict over the last 3 years. Most of the sensitive fighting had been elsewhere. And what we've seen over the last few months is fighting starting to occur in that state. The RSF have been launching attacks on various positions around the state, particularly across the south. And we think this is an attempt by the RSF essentially to open up their supply lines. They've had disruption to their supply lines elsewhere in the country, and they're trying to secure new ones. But there's been this open question of where they are launching those attacks from. The areas that they were attacking, particularly along the border regions of Blue Nile, do not link directly to territory controlled by the RSF, so it's been uncertain. And there's been some questions raised about whether they were launching these attacks from the neighbouring countries, the countries that neighbour Blue Nile, because Blue Nile sort of protrudes down from the bottom corner of Sudan and it borders southern Sudan to the west and Ethiopia to the east. And what we saw over the last few weeks is there are these attacks on the border towns that border Ethiopia, particularly a place called Kermuk, which fell to the RSF 2 weeks ago. And as I say, there's been this question of whether or not the RSF has been launching those attacks from Ethiopian territory. And what we've had this week is a major report from an organisation called the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, which uses satellite images and open source investigations to verify things from the air that are difficult to verify in the absence of ground investigations. And what they've been able to demonstrate is that over the border inside Ethiopia, there is a military base run by the Ethiopian military in a town called Asosa. And that military base over the last 5 months or so has been receiving deliveries on commercial car transporters of vehicles typically used by the RSF. We see social media videos and footage coming out of battlefields inside Sudan, where the RSF use these sort of pickup truck with mounted guns on the back of them. And you frequently see the RSF use these kind of vehicles as they're attacking a certain territory or a certain town. And in this base in Asosa, you've seen these vehicles arriving. They're commercial vehicles. They are unarmed when they arrive. And then you can see in these satellite images rows of these vehicles, and nearby on the ground rows of mountable heavy machine guns. And what the Yale team have been able to conclude with a high degree of confidence is that these vehicles are then being fitted at this Ethiopian military base, fitted with these mounted machine guns, and then being used in attacks where the RSF are crossing the border and launching attacks inside Sudan. So there you have the Ethiopian military colluding with the RSF to launch these attacks in Blue Nile, colluding with an organization that has been credibly accused of genocide in Darfur. And those attacks that the RSF are launching in Blue Nile are having obviously an enormous humanitarian impact in Blue Nile. We've seen significant waves of displacements. Just since the start of this year, there's been more than 28,000 is the latest figure from the United Nations. People displaced from Blue Nile. They're largely being displaced away from those areas where we're seeing these attacks on the border, and in the south of Blue Nile, they're being displaced northward. And so that obviously has an enormous humanitarian impact on those civilian populations, even aside from the fighting itself.
Yes, of course, I can imagine. I was about to ask you if it's something that you've been able to document, that this fighting, these attacks have been further pushing away people, running away from their homes, Sudanese people pushed into displacement, and in which region?
Yes, there's been, just since the start of this year, more than 28,000 people from the south of Sudan being pushed northwards. We're seeing that particularly from areas where the RSF have been launching these attacks. There's a border town, as I mentioned, called Kermuk on the Ethiopian border, where just from that town, and it's a pretty small town, more than 10,000 people have been displaced. And then there's been similar levels of displacement across the south of the state where these attacks are being launched. Those people largely are being pushed northwards into the north of Blue Nile state. The capital of Blue Nile, Damazin, is up further into the north. So most of them are going there or to some of the neighbouring regions. For now, the fighting has not spread as far north as Damazin. There is a question about whether it might do in the coming months. Some people have also been pushed over the border into neighbouring regions in places like Ethiopia. There's something like 4,000 people at least, according to the UN, that have had to flee over the border from Blue Nile into Ethiopia. So yes, we're seeing thousands and thousands of people being displaced, and that obviously has an impact, not just because of the immediate displacement itself, but it also means those people end up living in displacement camps. They have less food security, they have less access to healthcare, they have kids who are having to miss their education. As you can imagine, there are all sorts of knock-on effects from that kind of displacement.
Has now reached 3 years. It's been described at the beginning as a civil war because of the two leaders falling off into two factions. But we know many actors are also involved in the war, and recently so many people were displaced into Chad that actually the Chadian government has been very responsive and worried about the consequences. Now, why would we see Ethiopia choosing a side? And shall we add it to that controversial list of powers that have been accused of meddling in a conflict? The Arab Emirates have been accused of supporting the RSF. Egypt is very involved in the country because of its deep interest in Sudan. Accusations also run, obviously, about Russia and Ukraine. Do you have, as an organization like yours, any elements of why Ethiopia is getting involved, and if we can fear a deepening and a new crisis because of that?
Yes. So on the question of whether or not Ethiopia should be added to that list of external countries who are now involved in the war, I think the answer pretty unequivocally is yes. As I mentioned, that Yale report concluded with a high degree of confidence that the Ethiopian military were hosting the RSF or supporting the RSF from this base on Ethiopian territory, providing enormous logistical support. And the RSF was able to, off the back of that, launch its attacks into Blue Nile, those attacks that it would not be able to launch but for that support. So certainly the Ethiopian military is now involved in the conflict. As for why they are doing it, that's much more speculative, and there are lots of different kind of regional factors that you can talk about that could be motivating that decision on Ethiopia's part. You mentioned a country like the United Arab Emirates, which has again been widely reported, though it denies it, of supporting the RSF financially and politically. The UAE is a significant investor in the region, both in Ethiopia itself and in a number of countries across the Horn of Africa. They've invested enormous amounts of money in ports along the east coast of the Horn of Africa, and access to those kind of ports matters to a country like Ethiopia because it's landlocked. Ethiopia obviously has a fairly tense relationship over time with countries like Egypt because of the dam that they've been building on the Nile, which Egypt is concerned will affect the water flow up the Nile through Egypt or upstream. But obviously all of this is pretty speculative. It's hard to know exactly what their motivation is. As you say, there are all sorts of regional factors at play.
And then finally, another tricky question. The Horn of Africa has been the victim of the war in Iran quite deeply, and it affects aid in particular. So do you see that this news as more fighting beyond El Fasher, Darfur, and the core regions of attacks and violence in this war? Do you see that it's going to be harder and harder for organizations dealing with humanitarian aid to support Sudan in the current context where it's so much harder to send emergency aid to the Horn of Africa?
Well, certainly we've seen a massive impact from the aid cuts throughout this year, and obviously starting last year from the US aid, and not just the US aid cuts, but also lots of European governments have been cutting aid budgets, and that has undoubtedly had an impact on the ground. The UN's own operations in Sudan are chronically underfunded, and just straightforward access to the country is very, very difficult. There are lots of areas of the country where, even where there are shipments of aid that can arrive at the sort of bordering areas, even getting aid into those places remains very, very difficult. Even if you can get the necessary permissions, it becomes very, very dangerous. We've seen repeated instances of aid convoys being hit by drone strikes as they're trying to move across Sudan. The UN was able to get an aid convoy into there's a region in the sort of southern central part of Sudan called Kordofan, and particularly a state called South Kordofan, where there are two cities that have been under siege for much of the last 2 years, and the humanitarian situation there is pretty dire. There's probably famine occurring in those two cities. The UN was able to get an aid convoy to those cities in the last few months, but the area remains chronically underserved, and the humanitarian situation there is pretty dire. And we've also been seeing the knock-on effects of geopolitical instability more broadly. There was a report about fuel shortages in areas like Khartoum, price spikes for fuel because of the conflict in the Middle East. That's obviously going to have massive impacts on civilian life, on running infrastructure, in all sorts of ways, in a way that is going to have knock-on effects for humanitarian conditions in parts across Sudan.
Thank you very much for that. Do you want to call on to better ways to deal with this?
The two main things would be access for aid, as I was talking about then, and civilian protection. As I say, there are aid convoys that have been mobilized that are able to get to border regions that are not able to then move forward, and when they do, it can be very dangerous. So access to aid for communities that are currently cut off from aid would probably be one of the biggest differences you can make for civilians on the ground in the country, and increased international pressure, not just on the warring parties themselves, but also the external backers that are believed to be helping and financing them, like the United Arab Emirates. Pressure on those from international parties, anyone who has leverage with those parties, to allow aid into areas where it's needed is absolutely essential. And the second thing would be civilian protection. One of the features of this war that we see over and over again is civilians being deliberately targeted, particularly not just in ground assaults, but one of the real worrying trends at the moment over the last year or so has been a real uptick in the prevalence and use of drones across Sudan. And often those drone strikes are hitting civilian areas. They are hitting markets, hospitals, schools, they're hitting energy infrastructure. And in each one of those drone strikes, you get not just the immediate casualties, but you have the knock-on effects that, if a hospital is hit, that knocks out healthcare for people in that region can be hundreds of thousands of people. If an energy infrastructure is hit, that damages water treatment plants. And we've seen that happen where it then leads to cholera outbreaks. So the humanitarian impact of those kind of strikes is enormous. So a greater emphasis from the international community on preventing that kind of targeting of civilians, of civilian infrastructure is imperative.
Thank you so much. Christy Cooney is the chief of the Sudan team at the NGO Avaz. One aspect that is less obvious to outsiders is the impact the war has had on the country's culture and heritage. Joining me in the studio now to talk about exactly this is my colleague, Olya Horton. Hello, Olya. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you've been looking back at this topic. What can you tell us about the effects the fighting has been having on Sudanese cultural institutions?
Well, as you know, Melissa, shortly after the beginning of the war in April 2023, Khartoum, I think as they pronounce it locally there, it was taken over and the National Army was forced out by the rebel factions belonging to the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. Now, the palace and other very important public buildings, such as the Sudan National Museum, were ransacked and looted. Many ancient artifacts were damaged or stolen by the rebels, who attempted then to sell some of these items across the borders to traffickers. And elsewhere in the country, some of the museums faced an even worse fate. The Nyala Museum in South Darfur was converted into a military base. In El Fasher, the museum that was dedicated to Sultan Ali Jinnah was destroyed completely by fire in a bombing. So from a cultural perspective, this is a tragedy because Sudan has a long history dating back to ancient times. It's been marked by several royal dynasties, notably the Kingdom of Kush. It's home to the Black Pyramids in Meroe, a UNESCO heritage site that's around 200 kilometres north of the capital, and just one of the many, many sites of interest to archaeologists and historians in and outside of the country. To get a little bit of perspective on the gravity of the situation, I spoke to the Director of Museums for NCAM, the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums, Ikhlas Abdelatif. She told me that attacking cultural heritage is actually part of a strategy by rebels to take over the national story, to weaken unity and impose their own narrative.
Sudan heritage is impacted by this war. And directly threatened our identity by this war. And I think the identity and the history of Sudan was one of the weapons against Sudan from this militia. And also they targeted our identity, and they wanted to change the demography of history of Sudan, the demography of Sudan and the history itself.
Thanks to international coordination between the Sudanese government, UNESCO and Interpol, she says that around 500 of some 4,000 items that were stolen have been retrieved. Some of them were put on display in Port Sudan not so long ago, but many more, unfortunately, remain at large. And that's why Abdelatif says it's really important that people in the West stay vigilant.
And I would like to shed light for all the people in the world to look after our collection if they find it in auction houses, in any other hands. You will see it through the Virtual Sudan National Museum, Virtual Sudan National Museum. You can compare the collection which is in the Virtual Museum, and if you find anything in the auction houses in the future, please let us know, and please help us to recover all our collection.
And the capital Khartoum that you mentioned was then liberated in March 2025, brought back under the control of the National Army. Can you tell us what's the situation on that front, cultural front, today?
Well, at the beginning of the war, many people fled the city either to provincial areas or even across borders to neighbouring countries. With the NCAM, Ikhlas Abdelatif and her team set up an office in exile in Cairo, in Egypt, from where they still operate today, coordinating with their partners and their international partners from Cairo. They also set up a national committee to make an inventory of all the damage and relay information back to their colleagues. Luckily, Melissa, some of their colleagues stayed in Khartoum and were able to send updates and photos of the situation even while it was occupied. once the city opened back up again in March last year, they were able to go inside the various buildings, check the damage and the loss for themselves, and obviously send pictures and make notes and so on. Abdelatif says that it's thanks to this dedication of the colleagues in Sudan, along with international support from countries like France, that efforts to preserve Sudan's heritage have continued despite this awful conflict. One of these international bodies is Paris's Le Louvre Museum, which has been supporting research in Sudan for many years now. And I spoke to Marie Millet, who's an archaeologist in charge of the Egyptian Antiquities Department. The digs that she was overseeing in Sudan, unfortunately, have been suspended for the time being due to the war. But her experience in the last decade has been focused on some of the archaeological sites along the Nile River, such as the city of Meroe. And her latest project was focused on El Hassa, about 200 kilometres north of Khartoum. Luckily, she says their colleagues have been able to stay on and keep an eye on the sites and report back to them. Because while these sites they're in very isolated areas in the north of Sudan, so they're not directly in the conflict zones, but they've been caught up in different ways, as Marie Millet explained to me.
Ils ont été confrontés donc au déplacement de population. Et par exemple, il y a eu beaucoup de graffitis qui ont été faits sur les pyramides de Méroé, par exemple.
Marie Millet explains that the teams on the ground along the Nile River sites were confronted with population displacement due to the war. So people were coming into this area who don't normally live there. She said a lot of graffiti was found on the pyramids, some damage as well. So colleagues there had to go around and tell people, raise awareness that the heritage is very important and people should respect it, not use it as a sort of a camping ground, which was what was going on. She said that some of the colleagues had to intervene to rescue some of the excavations just at the last minute because people who'd been displaced were trying to build new homes and also cultivate land to grow crops because they've run out of food. So unfortunately, it was a very desperate situation, but they didn't mean necessarily to ruin any of the heritage sites. But thanks to the colleagues being there, they were able to speak to the local people about that.
The Louvre Museum is also involved in creating innovative pedagogical tools, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is quite neat because the Louvre Museum has an office that's dedicated to printing 3D replicas of historical models. So they are reproducing artifacts in smaller version, the smaller sizes, not the big statues, but smaller things, everyday items as well, bowls and jewellery and things like that, to help explain the ancient history of Sudan to visitors. So working in tandem with colleagues in Sudan, the Louvre has come up with this couple of designs for suitcases. They actually look like a suitcase and they contain several items that Sudanese colleagues can use to talk to the local people and show them, here's a replica of what used to be in this temple that has been now kept in the Louvre or elsewhere. And so they have items that are designed for teaching history in schools, but also for community outreach programs, which they do a lot of. Marie Millet says that Sudanese people are very interested in their history, very proud, and they're keen to preserve it in general once they know what we're talking about, because I think the archaeological sites that are not so visible to the naked eye, that's harder for them maybe to see. Millet describes here what can be found in these suitcases.
Dans ces mallettes pédagogiques, donc il y a tous ces aspects sensoriels, alors de la vie au bord du
Marie
Nil.
Millet says that in these educational kits there are all these sensory aspects of life along the Nile. There are smells like honey, for example. There's also the sound of a hippopotamus in the water. I'd like to hear that. And of course, other aspects of daily life. The target audience is for school children or people who don't know that much about Sudanese history, perhaps. But there is a second version which is more detailed, and this is the suitcase for the Sudanese colleagues, the archaeologists, to show them the milestones represented by objects so they can really discuss history in an in-depth way. There are items from Meroe but also Kerma representing the different periods of Sudanese history.
And has the Louvre been able to contribute to the protection of Sudanese heritage anyhow else?
Yes, in fact, the Louvre Museum has been working on some online projects. One is a digital platform that brings together all the existing archives. They've basically put everything online in the last few years to make it accessible for researchers and students alike. Then there's been the development of a virtual museum, which is quite cool. You can actually click on the rooms of the museum and walk through the Sudan National Museum and find out more information about the items. This is a joint project between Le Louvre and the SFDAS, which is the French section of the Sudanese Antiquities Department. And from that department, I spoke to Faiza Drissi, who is based in Cairo at the moment, and she's been overseeing the project, which has been in the pipeline for a while and has been accelerated by the war. And the first phase came online in January, with the second phase to follow in summer this year.
C'était déjà énormément le cas avant la guerre et c'est toujours le cas. D'ailleurs, le musée virtuel était très attendu par la population soudanaise.
Drissi says the virtual museum has been highly anticipated by the Sudanese population, especially school children, because despite the war, primary and secondary classes have continued and the preservation of this heritage relies on these programs. One of the key aspects of the virtual museum is its accessibility on various devices, such as smartphones, which means that people can access the information very quickly, not just using computers, but also on their phones. And the local community, she says, has been very concerned about their heritage, and they actively share information about it on social media.
Olya, it seems that despite the war, there is thus some hope that this Sudanese heritage will be preserved for future generations, right?
Yes, Melissa, I got the sense that speaking to these experts, despite all the hardships and logistical difficulties, there is already a strong sense of collaboration, a sense of purpose and solidarity in the research world. Ikhlas Abdelatif assures me that the government is still paying their salaries, which is a good thing, and hasn't intervened to prevent them from doing their work. However, the pressure to find international funding to keep up these projects remains a challenge, but one that she says is very much worthwhile. And to conclude from a word from Marie Millet from the Louvre Museum, she says saving heritage has been a triumph of science over politics in this case.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you so much, Olya, for reporting in depth on this cultural aspect of the war. This was the latest episode of Spotlight on Africa, a podcast produced by RFI English. It was mixed by our sound engineer, Erwan Rome. Thanks, Erwan. Thanks to all our guests, to Anne-Marie Bisada and Olya Horton. And thanks to you for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode. In the meantime, go to our website for more news and audio and videos, rfi.fr/en/Africa.